Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. You know, a happy marriage or partnership is the factor most highly correlated with a happy life, more so than money, career success, or even friendships. So today we address improving the quality of this relationship. We'll get ideas, techniques, and research facts that can go a long way to making your relationship more loving, less conflictual, and more joyful. With us to talk about this, psychologist Dr. Deborah Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman's been working with couples for 30 years. She's a past faculty member at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and she's the creator of the workshop Win-Win Relationships, Steps to True Intimacy. Thanks for joining us, Deborah.
Thank you.
Deborah, how many marriages do you think are really successful? What percentage?
Well, the guess is that it's something like 40%. About 75% of the marriages that are intact say they're happy, very happy, 3/4 of the time.
Oh, really? Well, that's pretty good.
That's pretty good. And the question is, of course, can one expect to have a completely joyful and happy marriage at all times? It's pretty unrealistic to expect that.
But half are divorced, is that?
Yeah, we get rid of those in the statistic, and then we
what's
say,
left?
okay, yeah. And of course, there are a number of people who stay married and are unhappy. So they do all kinds of things like looking at higher education and all that sort of thing tend to help, and having more resources so that you can handle the problems and then move on.
Wow. Why do unhappy couples stay together?
Well, we're supposed to say for the children, I think, at this point.
Uh-huh.
And that actually is a very high percentage. But there are a variety of things where people decide that it's better off or financially necessary to stay together. And if they're able to put back together the caring and remember the joy that made them choose each other to start with, then it can turn good again, even though they were ready to divorce.
Okay. Do you think most people, when they do get married, know what the heck they're doing?
I don't know if people know what the heck they're doing at all, but we think we do. And so the question is, do I want to share my life with this person? Do I trust this person? And will I grow by being with this person?
What I'm questioning is, so you date someone for a year and then you get married. How similar is the relationship 3 years after you get married to when you were dating?
Well, it depends on if you count the dirty socks.
Oh.
So the problem is that all relationships, even if they're non-marital and there's a long time before they get married, have sort of a honeymoon period, and then people sort of revert to being themselves. And it's a good idea. I always suggest to people that they date that person in a fairly consistent and exclusive, if you will, way for at least a year, because you want to go through all the tests of struggle and family connections and challenges.
What about living together? If you don't live together, do you really know? If you get married, then live together?
Well, there's some question about whether that helps at all.
Oh, really?
There are people who live together and still are on their best behavior, or at least relatively so. And there are also things that crop up in marriage after a number of years. And so it might be deliriously happy, or at least very satisfying for both for 3 years, 5 years. We've got the 7-year itch we talk about, and so on, where it's about 6 or 7 years when people say, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was going to be.
Well, wait a minute. Why do they know after 7 years? You think you know that after 6 months when you move with someone?
People think that it's what they interpret the cause to be. It's the person has a forgetfulness that's really okay and kind of endearing at first, but after a while wears thin. Things like that.
The very things that attracted you start repelling you?
They do indeed.
Wow. Well, why don't we get to work? I have certainly read many times that how you fight has a lot to do with success, and that fights are unavoidable, conflicts unavoidable. It's how you resolve it. So what are if you really want to screw up a marriage and fight badly, what are some of the typical ways people do it, and how should they fix that?
Well, we go to John Gottman for that, who has done some good solid research about it. And he has labeled 4 things that are very telling in terms of who will get divorced. So if these are seen in a couple interacting, your own situation or whoever has this, it's very likely that a divorce will occur at some point. So one of those is criticism, and we do know that about 2/3 of problems in a happy, long-lasting marriage actually never get solved. So it's not so much a matter of solving the problem as learning to work with it. So about 1/3 can be changed.
I have to ask you, when you say 2/3 of the problems never get resolved, what's an example where you don't kill each other but you haven't resolved a problem for 30 years?
Well, it might not be 30 years, but how the children should be brought up and all the details of that. Money, something that lasts a long time. Sometimes there are sexuality issues, and we have to work with all of those things so that we can agree to disagree and find good ways to meet both needs.
Okay. So, my question had so many sub-questions, I lost track of where you were at with
well, the criticism,
yes.
if one of the partners feels criticized, they're going to withdraw or they're going to defend themselves actively, and it's going to be a fight. So rather than using criticism, change that to curiosity.
Oh.
In other words, I really wonder why you're feeling that way. When I want to say, how can you possibly do that? You're such a jerk. And so part of this, of course, is also not using a sarcastic tone.
Well, let's get an example of a criticism. If I say to my wife, you were very mean at the party to 2 people. You were kind of nasty to them, and I've seen you do that before. That's criticism, isn't it?
It is, although it sounds nice.
Oh, okay.
So
how would you rephrase that with the same message and not be criticism? Or what would you? How could I do that better?
Well, you can ask what they need or what they were thinking, again, without any sarcasm, as opposed to what were you thinking. It might be something like, I was curious about how it felt for you when you were meeting those couple of people, because it looked like it wasn't so comfortable.
It was fine. They deserved what I told them. They were nasty.
Well, I guess the thing I wonder about is, I know I don't feel good if you say those things to me. So there may be some things that maybe in our marriage, whether you decide to react that way out in a party or wherever is one thing, but I'd like to share with you some of the ways in which maybe you could ask me how I'm feeling rather than telling me what I'm doing wrong. Why would I choose to do something like that, and so on.
I've also heard another way of doing this is, you're really a slob with all your clothes on the floor versus, gee, I'd sure appreciate it if you would keep your clothes off the floor. One is a complaint. You're a slob. The other is asking for a change in behavior.
Right, and one of the things that can really help in any twosome, which would include work and friendship and so on, is that you recognize that they have a right to live the way they want to. You just prefer something different. So you're saying basically, as a gift to me, would you put your dirty laundry in the closet or whatever?
Not good to say you're a slob.
Well, usually, even if it's said in humor, it hurts. And we're not trying to hurt, because we'll never get to a resolution if we put the person in an attack-defense mode. They'll have to defend themselves, and then you'll have to defend yourself.
Okay, so criticism is an attack requiring a defense. You want to make a suggestion or show your curiosity. Doesn't that sound a little phony? Gee, I was really curious about why you're such a jerk.
Well, it is definitely curious. Odd at first. It feels formal and strange. But as you do it more and more, it becomes natural for you. So you can say, gee, how come you chose to do it that way?
Oh, boy, I think I'd hear criticism under that.
You might.
Say, Deb she has got something negative to say, and she always uses the word she's curious.
You get to know each other, too. So the point is to make sure that you can have the conversation rather than I did not. Or something like that.
Okay.
And that takes us actually to the next thing, which is defensiveness. And rather than defending, even if you feel attacked, reminding yourself that they may or may not have meant to attack you, to really accept responsibility for at least a tiny part of what's going on. And maybe I like my dirty clothes on the floor, but I do know I put them there.
Okay. And what's behind defensiveness? Let's say you're upset with your partner, again, for the way they take care of things. They're sloppy. And you put it in as nice a way as you can. And I'd appreciate it if you would pick your stuff up. And they say, you're a bigger slob than me. You do it all the time, or whatever.
So
Why?
accepting a grain of truth and say, yes, sometimes I do. I know you're right.
That's good. But why do people who are defensive act that way? Why don't? What's so hard for them? Why
we don't like being attacked. And if you think about a snowball fight, if you get whacked with a snowball, most of the time you don't just walk away. Sometimes we have to learn to do that. That's one of the techniques that you can use. But you just, in some situations, rather than bringing it up later, we just sweep it under the rug and then we get it again. Okay. So when we feel attacked, whether we actually were or not, we'll defend. And a lot of major issues come up in marriages when there's a sense of contempt. And what that means is that rather than feeling appreciated, hearing praise or pride in what I did, you basically disrespect me. Mm-hmm. So where I want fondness and, some kind of specific admiration, I get eye rolling, smirking, and it's important to remember no name calling under any circumstances, because that'll set up this negative right away.
Like you're a jerk.
Yeah, you don't get to say, gee, I'm feeling like you're a jerk. Mm-hmm. That's cheating.
Yeah. Well, sorry to keep pushing this issue, but the issue of what makes one person more defensive than another, is it got to do with self-esteem? Is it a person who's insecure more likely to snap if you even subtly suggest something you'd like them to change than a person who's pretty squared away and centered?
Well, that's putting it quite globally. I think often we know what buttons to push, and we may even push them accidentally. Mm-hmm. So if there's something left for us from previous relationships, from previous times in the same relationship, or even from childhood, I'm a psychologist, I have to throw that in, but in point of fact, it's often something that never got resolved, and it feels like you don't have any idea what I'm dealing with inside myself about this, but you just plucked it up and stuck it on the surface. So I'm defending myself not only against you, but against all those histories.
So you hit a history. So sometimes you'll say something and the person blows, and you don't even think, what's going on here? I just said this, and they're blowing up.
Well, often we don't even know why we ourselves blow. So it's worthwhile to stop and say, why did I get so upset about that? What is that attached to like a chain for me? And can I do something else about it?
So we're hearing don't criticize, just get off your chest your needs and what you'd like. Don't show contempt. And that's really toxic, to show contempt. And you can show that in terms of what's a perfect example of contempt?
I would expect you to do something like that.
And that facial gesture you just did, I've heard that's universal to contempt, this kind of...
Well, it's usually a very quick eye roll and half a smirk.
Yes.
And so it's gone before the person who did it has to take responsibility for it, but the person who received it, who saw it, feels terrible and put down and made small.
Can you love someone and feel contempt for them?
Yes. You can love and hate someone. You probably won't keep the relationship, however, if you feel contempt and act that out, because you can't easily, at least at those times, suggest in your behaviors and your words and your choices what it is that you feel respectful and loving about. Respect is a big part of successful marriages.
What does that mean? Respect.
Valuing your choices, accepting that you're different from me, finding a way to make that okay. Respecting myself in a partnership means that I don't just do everything you want me to do, because then I will feel as if you've put me down, even though I did it.
And you've disappeared, really.
Exactly. And that leads to lots of depression and other sorts of problems.
So the opposite of respect is either what word or what behavior?
Well, I would say that it would be contempt. I think that's what we're talking about. Disrespect, and contempt, of course, is a very strong version of disrespect. Okay.
So we've got, don't show contempt. That's the worst thing you can do in a marriage. Don't criticize. Figure out another way of conveying your message. What's third?
Well, we're talking about the defensiveness, so that would be another one.
Yes,
and then also there's stonewalling, which is I feel flooded. Whenever that comes up, I may feel shame, and so I'm just going to turn into a stone wall. And I'm not going to answer your questions, and I'm going to move away from you, not by saying, this hurts and I've got to deal with it, I'll be back in 20 minutes and we can talk about it then, but by saying, okay, you always bring this stuff up, I'm not going to deal with this with you, and I don't care if you have differences about the money or the sex or, the children or whatever it is. I'm just not going to talk to you about that.
How can that be? I mean, what happens to the issue if you don't talk about it?
It blows up.
It blows up.
It does. Stonewalling is one of the things that really hurts relationships too. So what happens is it's very helpful to realize that if the other person is stonewalling you, or you're not being willing to respond, or you yourself feel overwhelmed, it's really about flooding, too much feeling at once. And when that happens, the brain actually changes. The part of the brain that is responding is much more the animal brain of self-protection and so on. So it's almost like they can't hear you.
Wow.
So it's very, very helpful to remember that it's too much stimulus for them. And how can you break it down and ask for a little conversation, or bring up a small part of that, with the understanding that you're not wanting to flood them.
I've heard this beef from a lot of women, that men refuse to talk about the relationship, or the emotional issues in the relationship, or whatever, and it drives them nuts. And are you suggesting the reason, if my premise is right, a lot of men won't talk about it, they just can't handle it because they're flooded emotionally when you bring it up, like, what? Let's talk about what's going on between you and I. I'm feeling distant from you, or lonely in this way. I don't want to talk about it.
Right. Well, it's also the suggestion that whatever they do is going to be wrong. Many men, at least stereotypically, aren't as fluid in discussing relationship issues and so on. Sometimes we get the opposite, of course. But very often there's shame involved, because they knew that they did something that they shouldn't do, and they don't want to get caught at that and thought badly of, or that they think they're going to have to do something they really don't want to do, that is very important to them, and might even represent whether they're an independent person and a partner, as opposed to a lesser partner, and so on. So it's really important, if you're finding yourself flooded, to soothe yourself. And it's actually suggested that men take about half an hour to calm down physiologically when they get flooded. So just self-soothing with quiet breathing and saying, you'll be back and we'll discuss this, but let's discuss a little tiny bit at a time.
So stonewalling is the refusal to discuss it, not the refusal now, but postponing it for later.
That's right. If you refuse to discuss it, as opposed to saying, it's hard for me right now, I got to hold off here, and let's talk about it on the weekend. And could you pick the most important thing you want to talk about, and let's not talk about any other part of this?
Wow, don't you want to help those people who can't stand talking about stuff? I mean, I just pull them aside and say, let's talk about why you're so scared to talk about these things.
Well, that's what we do in counseling and therapy.
Do you?
And often we can help each other. You can take a walk, for example, and then you don't have to face each other while you're talking, and so on. So there are ways you can kind of get counseling in life, or therapy in life, if you will, by saying, okay, what is it that I need to do when I get flooded to calm down and be able to talk?
You know, someone might be listening to this who's dating and thinking of getting married to the person, and they're thinking, no, not me. I don't know who you're talking to, but it's not me. We get along great. You have anything to say to them?
Well, we tend to get along great while we're on our best behavior and want to be chosen. And we're also in a heightened state of sort of an adrenaline rush, if you will, and certainly heightened state of alertness. And so we notice things that we're doing, and then after a while we want to be comfortable. So
what does that mean, want to be comfortable?
Well, we'll wander around in our underwear, for example, and the other person says, would you please put on a shirt, before we sit down to dinner? And the first one says, give me a break. It's my house too. So there's a real difference in, what that nest means to each of them, and so on.
So issues will come up.
They definitely will come up.
Gee, that's disillusioning to some people, I'm sure.
Well, the thing is, it's sort of like if you have to play a board game of some sort. You get to roll some dice, you get to make some decisions, you get to take certain action. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. After people resolve things like that are very difficult for them, they feel much closer. It's actually some of the route to intimacy.
So you're going to have conflict.
Yes.
And as you work it through, you're going to be even better.
That's right. And that's, of course, if you don't get divorced. And so the question is whether you fall into the criticism, defensiveness, contempt, or stonewalling, in which case you have to fall back out of them.
So you got to learn how not to do these things and do something better. Let's talk about how do you enhance the relationship so it remains or is joyful and loving. Any tips for us?
Well, one of the things is how to talk.
Oh, okay.
And how to play. And some of the color of the relationship, if you will. If you think back to why you were first attracted to this person and the kinds of things you did, very often the natural stages in a marriage include a point at which it's almost all day-to-day work. You have to take care of the children, or you have to deal with the yard or the house or whatever it is, and the fun things and the sense of shared freedom get lost. And so thinking back about what it was about the fond memories early in the relationship and what your dreams were for this person, rather than trying to pretend to yourself that he or she actually is those things, being able to say, wait a minute, I felt like that when we were on a bike ride. Let's take a bike ride. Neurologically, there are behaviors and activities and even places that are anchored to certain feelings. And so if you go back to some of those places, sometimes you'll feel those early feelings.
Okay, so it's just very easy to slide into routine and mundane activities of life, of living.
Exactly.
And how do you agree on how to change this if you're in that kind of negative?
Well, first of all, it's very important to recognize that the other person is in that situation for a reason. It may come out, what do you expect me to do? I've got kids and work and the house, and then I'll throw in and you don't do your share.
Yeah.
So then we've got to fight. So what we want to do instead is to say, wait a minute, what am I missing that I need to get? And how can I legitimately get that so that it's not feeling like I'm judging you or more imprisoning you. Rather, each of us needs some of those things that help us cope, that connect us to other people, and some free time.
Yeah. So that's an issue of space. I mean, how much of that is typical in working through a marriage, figuring out how much time alone versus together, and having different ideas on that?
I think that's almost always the case.
Really?
And it's because before you're married, that's not an issue, or at least before you're living together. And then there's an assumption. For example, well, of course we spend all holidays together. No, I always spend holidays with my family, and so on. So even though we have a picture, we discover that the other person doesn't agree with us, as opposed to, gee, that we might need to come up with something that will work for both.
So in terms of keeping the love that was there when you were dating, which goes away in part, you're saying, because you're doing all these mundane...
Well, the actions of the love, not the love itself.
Okay. The love might be there, but it's not...
It's covered up with all the laundry.
Okay. Besides doing the things that were fun when you were dating, if you have the time, what else can you do to keep that love alive?
Well, part of it is that early love is in a sense, an illusion. And so what actually offers itself later on is a much deeper intimacy, where you have to actually talk about your worries, your stresses, your hopes, and your fears, and listen to the other person's. And one of the things that you can do is elicit the other person's concerns for the day or for the subject matter or whatever it is, without any judgment whatsoever. You're going to have your own preferences, but not to think that you're right and the other person is wrong.
You're saying being a great listener?
It's very important to be a great listener.
Now, come on, how many people are great listeners?
All you need to do to be a great listener is to look like you're paying attention, actually pay attention, and be able to respond in kind. Not to fix them or to correct them or direct them, but to say, so kind of what you're saying is that you feel really exhausted by Thursday and ...
You know, I could picture marriages going on for years without those kind of conversations.
They do. And part of the situation with who gets divorced and who doesn't is simply who makes that choice. So, for example, if you're in a marriage based on a religious belief and you're not happy, but you don't feel like you can legitimately get divorced, many times you'll go through these problem times and then come to a quiet sitting on the porch kind of time again and have another opportunity. But you don't have the intimacy until you actually have these concerns. You need to know what your partner is feeling and doing on a daily basis, even if you don't get all the details.
How is that different from a very good friendship?
Well, sex. And sometimes
and do you
there
have to have
isn't
sex to have a good marriage?
No, you don't. But I kind of think of it as the glue of a marriage or a relationship, because it has that vulnerability. You can't really full out be sexual with someone without being quite vulnerable to them, which means you must trust them. And it also communicates that trust. And they feel like they can be vulnerable as well and feel very open to you because you trust them and they trust you. So if you can get to those things without the sex, it's totally fine. And obviously, traditionally women, but people want to have that out of the bedroom as well as in the bedroom.
What
they want to have the vulnerability and the trust
okay.
and the connection, how your life is going for you, what you're scared about, what you're worried about.
Let me play devil's advocate here.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you have a marriage that's quite intimate? Well, no, let's do the opposite. How about if your marriage is real sexy?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have sex 5 times a week and it's great.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the two of you refuses to talk about their emotions, their internal reality. They are kind of a closed book. Is that an intimate marriage?
No. And in point of fact, when I ask in therapy, when someone brings up intimacy as an issue, I ask them, are you talking about sex? Mm-hmm. And often if, again, we're being stereotypic, the man will say, yeah, I mean sex. And the woman will say, no, I mean connection. I mean understanding each other and touching each other in a loving sort of way as opposed to a purely sexual sort of way. A lot of people are sexual, especially early in the marriage or in dating and so on, rather than talking. So they actually use it as an avoidance. And then somebody's going to feel unhappy about that.
Well, this is my thing I'm going to ask you about. It seems to me men are raised totally differently than women. If we're talking about heterosexual, of course, there's gay relationships very different. But, men they're raised to parallel play. They play basketball while they're shooting some hoops. They might talk about, did you have a date last night? Yeah, how was it? Good. Okay. And then go back to hoops. That's enough. And girls, when they're 15, might say, how was your date? Really? What happened? What did he say? Blah, 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 blah. So they really connect. And then you throw these two creatures together in a relationship. How can it work? How can they be intimate?
Well, one of the things that, again, the stereotype of the girl you're talking about as she grows up, when she's in a boy-girl relationship, she needs to recognize that you can't just pound somebody with the kinds of questions that you would perhaps a girlfriend, because they're not on that same openness and trusting relationship yet. And so part of it is not to bombard them and to say, well, what was that like for you? Oh, it's okay. Well, I guess what I'd like to know is, and to ask as specific a question as you can about it.
So you're talking about training men?
Yes, and training women.
So you're training women to be
back off just a little about that without giving up what they want.
Okay, but that sounds to me like you're saying men are socially not as skilled as women, so don't expect as much.
They're not socially as skilled. They're differently skilled.
Oh.
And they can handle crises in a different way sometimes or whatever. And it's important to recognize that in gay relationships, for example, sometimes people will take one of these roles and and the other one will take another without even recognizing it. One tends to be more connective and the other one may be more assertive or try to use the sex for avoidance and so on. So it's not always based purely on how you grew up.
There's some people who just shouldn't even get married, should stay single, stay not in an intimate relationship.
Well, it's not that the whole person shouldn't, but there are skills, actually individual relationship skills, that are not just based on this particular relationship. If I know how, for example, to bring something up positively and softly without mashing somebody with the issue right away, then I know how to get to the next step and so on. So if someone wants to learn these things, they almost always can. They're very specific things where I want the caring and the partnership and the play of being married in a long-term kind of relationship that I can count on. Then I need to learn, just like playing a board game, you need to learn how to play chess and so on.
Which leads to, shouldn't marriages have a training program before you get a license?
Well, it would be nice, and it would be nice if we got these kinds of lessons and information in high school or elementary school. And of course, where we get them is at home, we watch our parents and we say, oh, I don't mean to be doing the same thing, but we find ourselves doing the same thing later on. There are more and more courses like that in college, and they do make a huge difference for the participants.
No kidding. I never saw one. Of course,
they
I'm old.
definitely-
But there are
More
courses
now
how
than
to
they did.
succeed in marriage courses?
Well, yes, how to deal with the opposite sex, or how to relate to people in a way that works, and that sort of thing. And it's really about exactly what we're talking about here. There are also lots of courses in this sort of thing available in the community, or if you want to go as part of a vacation, there are some very good ones out of town that are weekend long or a week long. But the basic idea is that you can learn them, and that most people take about it's about 4 years of experiencing discomfort and unhappiness with whatever is going wrong with their marriage before they come in. So if you can figure it out ahead of time or talk with someone ahead of time, premarital counseling is an example of that. There are books that help with that too.
Deborah Hoffman, thank you very much for kind of introducing this subject to people. Gives them a lot of food for thought and maybe reduces their expectation to something a little more realistic.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.